As you join us today, we encourage you to reflect on the land that you're on and its history. We're located on the treaty lands and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit and the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, the Wendat, and the Haudenosaunee.
The territory is within the lands protected by the Dish with One Spoon, Wampum Belt Covenant and is home to many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. We are grateful to work on this land.
The future of film and TV production is in Ontario. We've expanded our studio space. We've built virtual production sets, Canada's largest backlot, and an unparalleled workforce. Our Ontario Green Screen program ensures a more sustainable industry. We are Ontario, and we're ready to roll.
And if it wasn't for Toronto, actually, I would not be here talking to Toronto.
Stories. That is the foundation of what we do as artists, just stories.
More people who look like us and think like us are in positions in which we can hire people who haven't had opportunities before in this industry. That is a cause for optimism.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Toronto International Film Festival's Industry Conference. My name is Jeff McNunn, and I'm TIFF's Senior Director of Theatrical and Industry, as well as Programmer of Prime Time. I'd like to thank our lead sponsor, Bell, our major sponsors, RBC, L'Oreal Paris, and Visa, and our major industry supporters, Telefilm Canada and Ontario Creates. I'd also like to thank our media partner, Screen International, for supporting all of our prospective sessions. It's my great honor to introduce our next panel, Narrative Sovereignty, Pathways to Partnerships and Collaborations for Indigenous Productions. Building on last year's Narrative Sovereignty session, this year we will turn the focus to institutions and the role they play in supporting Indigenous storytelling through partnership and cross-organizational collaboration. Leading us through this conversation is moderator Bird Runningwater, director of the Indigenous program at the Sundance Institute. Bird, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me and so many of these wonderful partners that you are all about to meet. My name is Bird Runningwater. I belong to two tribes. I belong to the Cheyenne and Mescalero Apache tribes. I was born and reared on the Mescalero Apache Reservation in southern New Mexico. And in my Mescalero language, I would say, it's really good that we can all be here together. I was on this panel last year, and we're doing it again the same way, given the state of the world. And I just wanted to take a moment to particularly acknowledge one, the state of the world, but also kind of the implications that this pandemic has had, on all of our communities, specifically Indigenous communities. I myself lost family members, and my communities were hit very hard. And I know that many of us experienced that same tragedy. And so I just wanted to acknowledge that and hope that we can continue to, uplift everyone with our good thoughts and healing thoughts. And thank you for that. I'm dialing in today from the lands of the Tongva people here in Los Angeles. They are the original inhabitants that the city of LA sits upon, and I'm always grateful to them. Over towards the ocean, towards Malibu, we have the Chumash people. Over the mountain over here, we have the Tataviam people. So they are the lands on which our American industry, film and television industry sits. And so I wanted to acknowledge those nations as well, and to thank you for giving our industry a home. I wanted to move on and just have our panelists join us. I would like for them to introduce themselves because it's a really amazing global panel of people who are coming to us from Indigenous lands literally around the world. And, we all are here. We all know each other. We're all friends and families of a very tight-knit and supportive international Indigenous film industry. We work together, we collaborate together, we cry together, we cheer each other on. And I'm just so pleased that we can all be together in this way. Traditionally, we would be going to one another's lands and being hosted and being fed and being able to interact, but this will suffice until we're able to do that again. And so who would like to kick us off with your introduction of yourself and your nation and your work that you do? We'll start with Karen. Karen's in the morning right now, so in Aotearoa.
Tēnā koutou katoa, e mātakitaki ana I tēnei o ngā kōrero o ngā iwi takitaki o te ao. Aio ki te rangi, aio ki te whenua, aio ki ngā mea katoa. Mauri ora ki a tātou. So just asking for blessings on us all at this time and bringing us all in together. It's my privilege to be a part of this panel with some giants also that are part of the sector, and I feel like I'm very much a younger version of many of these people. So ko te o kahurangi tōku ingoa tūpuna no Te Arawa Waka, mai make tū ki tō ngariro. Ko au te pau whakahaere o te tumu whakaata taonga. So my name is Karen Te o Kahurangi Waka. I hail from the Te Arawa Waka or canoe and the Mātātua canoe, the region from Maketu on our shores through to the Central Plateau and our three Kāhui mountains, our three large mountains in the central North Island of New Zealand, Aotearoa. Born and raised in Rotorua, currently living in Tamaki Makaurau, and I work as the lead of the Māori strategy for the New Zealand Film Commission, or Te Tumu Whakaata Taonga. So I'm a Māori speaker, Māori whakapapa, Scottish, Irish, and of course New Zealand heritage. So my role here with the Rautaki Māori is to support the aspirations and the mutually agreed pathways for our people in the film sector and within our communities, and represent them in the mahi or the work of the New Zealand Film Commission. Kia ora tātou.
Tēnā koe, Karen. Anna Lila, since you're very far in the north, let's go to the north.
Joo, päiviä. Mun amalla Anna Laila Utsi ja mun län Tapasaamis, Davin ja mun jälle huistora illun tässä läkkifadas tiikuin farus. Yes, my name is Anna Laila Utsi, and yeah, I am very far up north, now in the northern part of Norway, which is also our homeland, Sápmi. And our people, the Sami people, we are indigenous peoples here in the Scandinavian countries, but also some of us are in Russia. So I'm really happy to be here in this panel with as Bert says, our indigenous film family, many dear colleagues here, and very much looking forward to this talk. So thank you.
Thank you. We'll go back to the Southern Hemisphere with Angela. Angela?
Hi. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal and Bidjigal people of the lands on which I'm zooming in from. And I'm proud Aboriginal woman, Maliyangappa and Barkindji from Western New South Wales, out in the outback, semi-arid desert country. And on my mum's side, I'm also Māori, Te Whānau Apanui, and with links to Kahununu. So, yeah, it's a great privilege to be on the panel as well. I work for Screen Australia's First Nations First Nations Department. And Karen, you said you feel like a young'un. I feel like a baby on this panel. But yeah, it's a great honour and privilege to be here with you all.
Thank you, Angela. Jesse, back in the Northern Hemisphere.
Yes, thank you, Bird. Ani Bojo. My name is Jesse Wentz. I'm Anishinaabe, born and raised in Toronto, or Toronto. My dad's side of the family comes from a small place called Chicago, and my mom's side of the family comes from Ganabajing, which is on the north shore of Lake Huron. Here in Ontario. I'm on my people's lands, although we also share these lands with the Huron-Wendat and the Haudenosaunee. And I'm taking from, and I am Bear Clan. I am taking Bird from the way this is already going, that if all of these folks are the young folks, I think we know where that's landing you and I.
Exactly.
But it's wonderful to be with my cousins, as always.
Always. Thank you all very much, and it's such a pleasure to see you. I've been kind of wrestling with, gosh, what first of all, where do we start, right? Where we all work in Indigenous storytelling. We all work within different structures and institutions, and in an industry that I feel like hasn't always necessarily been that kind to our stories and to our own, our own storytelling. But I'm really interested, I think, I think we will get to that. But I'm really interested to know, like, if any of you can just kind of offer maybe something, some aspect of your traditional storytelling. I'll start us off by saying that, in the summertime in my Mescalero home, we have coming of age ceremonies for young women because we are a matriarchy, and we celebrate, when a young woman becomes a woman of the people, because, the future of our nation relies on, more children and motherhood and those important blessings. But one of the things that I love the most about it is that we get to recount our narrative, from the most, from the original points of creation and the stages of creation, and how the world came about and how we arrived in our particular sacred lands. And I always love, that recounting and the beauty of it, because it always reminds me that, I'm one of the original inhabitants of this land that makes up, the United States, long before the United States ever came about, long before there were borders, dividing me from Jesse and, and influencing the ways that we work nowadays. But I was just curious if anyone else had a favorite, of their own traditional storytelling that they could kind of kick us off with.
I could start, and here in Sápmi, we have rock carvings that are about 10,000 years old, and they are very near to my home place, and also where our Sami Film Institute is. And it's really fascinating to see these stories that are carved in these rocks for such a long time ago, and still the stories they told about reindeer and reindeer fences and hunting and fishing, it's still alive within our culture today. And so our storytelling has traces back a very long time, and still today there's a story about my son. When he was young, we were visiting our grandmother, and he was looking out the window, and then he turned to us and he said, oh, I saw this little old lady running very fast into the woods, and she had a very long stick, and she had this traditional dress on, and our grandmother said that, yeah, but it's the underground grandmother, she's just passing by, don't worry. So it's so our story, we do have a lot of the traditional stories and mythical characters, but they are still very much alive in our reality, and we can see them and we can feel them. So it's a wonderful treasure for our filmmaking. So
Wonderful.
Kia ora no tātou. Yeah, I guess for me, I mean, I'm born and raised in Rotorua, largely what was known as a tourism town, but my ancestors, my grandparents grew up telling the stories of what was known then as the pink and white terraces around the mountains of Tarawera. And it was a visiting space where many of the early visitors to our land would come, and it became, of course, what was known as the tourism industry. But a lot of the conversations started with the essence of manakitanga, or hospitality, where we were guiding people and making sure that any visitors, one was always knowing who was in your hood and actually just being aware of people coming in, but then you would guide them. You would be the kaiarahi, or the guide, to make sure that they were safe while they were in our spaces. And that, I think, is very much translated into the way that we tell our stories. One, it was in our own language. And so we then took on their language so that we could communicate with them. And of course, we have different ways of expressing ourselves in terms of waiata or songs and carvings and weaving. And my family have grown up around carvers and weavers and those themselves. And so guiding, looking after our people, being a great host, and then taking them in, and then through that time you share story. You sit and you feed them with both food that nourishes them, but also the stories of our people, so that we can connect with one another and, again, be safe, know that our customs, and guide them that, you don't do these things, but please do these things. And that hasn't changed at all in the way in which I now work within the film industry. And having been part of singing and dancing most of my life, and still today, that again transmits the way in which we want to express ourselves. And that's part of what I love, is to be able to express myself in song and then visually, so that a lot of our art forms were visual arts, because that's how we could keep our stories alive. But the taonga wasn't just the visual representation of the weaving or the carving or whatever it was, but it was actually the story that would go with it. And we call those things taonga. And we can pass a taonga, whether it's a greenstone or whatever it is that we want to share. But the most important thing is the story that goes with it, because you transfer the taonga or the gift or the treasure to someone else. And that story between the two of you goes with that taonga. Years later, that taonga then is passed on to someone else. And then again, it extends the story again. So it's just a sharing and a continuum of all of these stories that, not surprisingly, ends up normally back within your family. And then all of that has been transmitted in terms of the stories that we've carried. And it wasn't until I was starting, I'd been a part of making television and then films, that I realized just the huge lifespan of films, particularly, that we have in the archives now that we have of television and programming, that all of that is really the essence of what my tupuna, and I know many of those on this call, have had, where we're sharing them as taonga. It's why we call Te Tumu Whakaata Taonga. It's about the expression of sharing these gifts and these treasures in films and in the content we make, and the stories that go alongside them. Kia ora.
Thank you. Jesse or Angela?
For Anishinaabe, storytelling, there was many forms of it that it would take. But I'm reminded, it was Bird, you were talking about a ceremony in your community. My great uncle sadly passed a couple weeks ago, but it gave me an opportunity to go home to the community. And when someone passes, there's a whole ceremony that goes around that's very much storytelling based, as we sing them onto their final journey. And I was just reminded that every trip home is an opportunity to hear new stories and to sort of connect with some of that. And one of the stories I heard on this trip that I hadn't realized is, so my community, Benabijing, the Canadian government, or what it's called now, is Serpent River First Nation, and it exists on the Serpent River in Ontario. And there are pictographs, so paintings on the rocks by the community. And many of these are thousands and thousands of, as much as 10,000 years old. And many of these pictures have the people riding the serpent, like physically on top of the serpent. And it was on this trip that I had never quite understood what I was looking at when I saw those before. And then an elder said, yes, we have stories that our ancestors would ride the snakes, that you would be able to be carried by them. And this opened up a whole new world of possibilities and understanding and knowing. And I'm just at the beginning of just that small piece of knowing what they were saying. I learned on a previous trip several years ago that our ancestors would bend trees in order to indicate important places. So often you'll find tree trunks that have very right angles because they would bend them so that we would know decades later, generations later, where to find what they were indicating with these markers. So I have to say, Bird, as I grew up in the city, so for me, this is still very much an act of reclamation and gaining back what was taken from my family and taken from so many of our communities. And there's nothing quite like connecting with those stories that are much, much older than any of the more modern stories that get told on these. These are stories that are as my elders would say, as old as this place is. They're as old as this. So that's my little share for this one.
Thanks, Jesse. That's beautiful. Angela?
Yeah, I guess over here in Australia, we've got our creation stories, our Dreamtime stories, and I think one of the most popular ones is the Rainbow Serpent story that created the lands. And, I love our Dreamtime stories because they're always told with some kind of moral lesson in it. And, we have our song lines over here as well. So, which also talk about the creation of country. And where I'm from, my traditional country, Murruwinji, which is a national park now, and, similar, have tourism out there. And, I remember growing up in country and being taught lots of, stories about whether it's the, plants or the animals, or our, caves and engravings and stuff. Yeah, so I just, but it's interesting because, as a kid you grow up and you get taught to look, listen and learn. And then, that storytelling comes much later on the oral side of it as well. So, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you all for all of that. I just wanted for us to kind of take a moment to kind of ground ourselves. And I think like one of you said, the continuum that we're all coming from. One of the philosophies that I always kind of imbue with some of our contemporary Indigenous storytellers, that I work with through Sundance Institute, is just kind of to tell them that, their stories that they're telling now on film are part of an ancestral continuum, and if we flash forward, to this moment from the moments of creation that we're all talking about, it's kind of like, there have been so many different occurrences in all of our own lands by foreign visitors that have dictated, how we have adapted and how we continue to, I feel like, really kind of innovate in our own ways with our own levels of indigeneity to keep those flames of these particular kinds of storytelling, alive. I think that one of the things that all of us have in common now, besides our indigeneity, is like how that I feel like that we have to deal with the structures around us that kind of dictate kind of an industry to our colleagues, who are watching and listening to us right now, and and the methods by which that industry really, I feel like, in the 100+ years of cinema, we weren't involved in that. We weren't involved in the creation. We weren't involved in the creative control, the narrative sovereignty of that, historical cinema. I think each one of our countries, I feel like the earliest stories of cinema in our countries, were representations of us. And so I often say that today's Indigenous filmmakers have such a huge burden to carry, because not only are we expected to, like everybody else, create something authentic, create something innovative, something new, but we also carry that burden of having to deconstruct 100 years of cinema and misinformation that is carried by audiences, that still lives today. And so that's a particularly heavy burden, So I wanted to just, and I know that we're kind of focusing on international partnerships. I know a part of the context of these, these colonial structures and systems that we have to work with, those of us in the United States, very different from your countries. It's like we don't have production treaties, international production treaties. And if you think about Sundance, we are an NGO, a nonprofit organization that kind of butts up against the industry. And so I've been able to really find, I think, great, interesting partnerships. We partner with Jesse at the Indigenous Screen Office, to include Indigenous filmmakers from throughout Canada in our Sundance lab programs. I know that Anna Lila, launched the Arctic Indigenous Film Fund. And when I asked, why is Alaska not included with that? It's because of this American thing that we have to deal with. And I said, can we please include Alaska? She said, yes, and you can join our board. So now I work with Anna Lila, the Arctic Indigenous Film Fund. I've partnered with, with the NZ Screen Office as well to, support our Merata Mita Fellowship, which we honor a global Indigenous woman, who is endeavoring to direct a feature film. And, we've been actually able to select, so many amazing Indigenous women emerging from each one of your specific territories, and Angela and I have yet to figure out how we can do something together, and we will. But tell me, I guess maybe in the context of treaties and, production treaties and co-pros, I know that some of you guys have really collaborated in that realm. Can any one of you kind of discuss that area?
Kaz, do you want to talk about we've got a co-production happening right now, actually.
Yeah, we can jump in together, maybe, Ange. So, I mean, when I first came into the Film Commission, it was interesting when I heard this term treaty. Of course, the first and paramount one for us here in Aotearoa is our Te Tiriti o Waitangi. So it was a really different thing when I started to learn that there were all these other treaties in terms of a global space around film. But I guess for me, that's the first premise of acknowledging our own treaties for our tangata whenua, our own people of the land, and ensuring that our voices are heard in these spaces. But the opportunity now, and particularly as an example of this panel, is reaching out to our cousins around the world and being able to work together. And I think it was around 2018 when I first started, and someone had suggested that it would be great to have an Indigenous working film with Australia, because there had already been discussions with the different CEOs. But the minute I joined as the Rautaki Māori, which the Film Commission had been around for 40 years, and when the Rautaki started, that was 3 years ago. So we've, as you say, Bird, it's taken a long time for the actual sector to include us to a point where we actually are driving our own strategies ourselves within and around the organisation. So that suggestion of working with Australia was really how Angela and, acknowledging Penny too, Pellis Monicum, and the work that she was in terms of getting this up as well. But we've brought together 8 teams, 4 from Australia, 3 Māori and 1 Pacific Island team, to create a joint Indigenous initiative or anthology. And one of the things was, I guess, that some of the people who'd been involved prior to me joining had a certain thinking around how it would look. But the minute you get all the black fellas and the Māori and the Pacific people in the room, well, we decided ourselves how else it's going to be. And that was the great thing, is that the first thing we did was, no, we've got to come together. We went to Australia and we had a session all together, which was, as we've done this morning, just to get to know one another and ground ourselves in our own stories, both individually, tribally, and as countries. And nations, and then started looking at what the stories our respective teams had brought together. But the other really important thing was the relationship that the agencies had in being able to deconstruct, as you say, Bird, some of the things that would normally normally be done in terms of how we would operate these different co-productions. And it was driven very much from, okay, these aren't normal, the things we're doing aren't normal in terms of or what we're used to in the system. So let's deconstruct it, and how do we, this is what we want, what's the intention? How do our people want to work? And how is that going to be made possible and supported by the organisations? And I mean, that's how I feel about it, Anjan, to see, we've just had the rough cut this week. And so it's been exciting to actually see, you know, that started 2018-19. So it's taken a few years, COVID in the middle, all of that, which has really affected our teams. It's gone from being, oh yeah, we're going to give some money and it's going to look like this and it's going to be, you know, done in a year, to 3 years later. It's a co-production. It's accessed the New Zealand Screen Production Grant Fund. It's accessed the Australian offset. It's also had COVID relief funds and the COVID indemnity money from our side, let alone I'll get Ange to talk about the extent in terms of Australia. Kei au koe, Ange.
Yeah. Yeah, I think from our perspective too, you know, we have a 28-year history with the First Nations Department in Australia, and yeah, Penny Smallcombe, I want to acknowledge her as well, because I think the idea came about from the anniversary of Captain Cook, you know, the Endeavour journey he took through Australia and everywhere else. And so these stories ended up turning out to be, you know, the themes of survival. And I was the same as Karen. I just started Screen Australia's First Nations Department, and Penny said, I've got the perfect project for you. You're Māori, you're Aboriginal. And so, you know, probably one of the biggest and challenging projects that I've had, you know, happened to be my first one. But it's such an historic, you know, thing for us, because it is our very first international co-pro. And we have, you know, Australia as a whole has treaties with a number of different countries, I think, including Canada. So we can maybe even look at doing a co-pro with you guys next, you know, maybe. But there's, you know, obviously lots of challenges and, you know, with COVID, but financing, all of that sort of stuff. I think during the co-production, though, what was really great, it was a real collaboration. You know, we mirrored our legal agreements, our financing. We had, you know, producers in Australia had an advantage, I guess, in that they can tap into state funding as well as national funding. But yeah, it's been a real journey, and I love that it was 100% Indigenous, you know, from our writers, directors to our producers as well, and, you know, giving opportunities to support our amazing emerging producers, Mia and Mitch Stanley and Tony Stowers on the Australian side, but Mia on the Tierney Henry on the New Zealand side as well. But yeah, we're, you know, sorry?
No, I was going to say that the one of the other things was that while it originally had aligned with the anniversary of the Captain Cook celebrations, the minute we came together, you know, the first thing that everyone said, we're not going to make it about that. It's about us. It's not about that. I mean, the fact that it extended was, I guess, not so much a bonus. It's just what it was. It's just how things rolled, is that we ended up being who we wanted to be. And you know, and also I think it's interesting that no matter, and personally, that when you're in an organization and you are in some respects representing and carrying that mantle for your people, that sometimes you're expected to be a public servant or to be part of the organization. And I'm never that. I mean, I am working for my people and I can work within those organisations, but I am Māori first. I am Te Arawa. I am proudly, you know, working to support those initiatives of our people. And that what I do within these organisations actually is to, you know, access and support both the organisation and our people mutually. So it's to support those things. And the words or the title we had on the Māori, on the New Zealand side was Ngā Pou Whenua. Ngā Pou Whenua. So ngā being plural, pou is a stake in the ground, and whenua, and that's of course the land. So when I was listening to you, Jesse, about, you know, bending the trees. That's exactly the minute you came into different spaces around, you know, in our traditional spaces, in our tribal areas, when before the coming of the European, that's what it was. They were stakes in the ground that you knew when you were moving between different nations or different areas and tribes. And that's what we started as being representative of this project between our two countries, was to be able to remind, I guess, the essence of this is around our voice and our stake in the lands that we come from.
Wonderful. And Alila, tell, you know, I know that, you know, with the Arctic Indigenous Film Fund, that's a circumpolar Arctic effort and strategy. It's like spanning Scandinavia, Russia, going all the way around, you know, to North America, Canada, Greenland, all of these, you know, amazing countries. Like, how is that going and how's that working? Because I know that you have a ton of very strong partners, you know, who are helping you to launch that.
Yes, it's going really well, and of course also we have you and Sundance as one of the establishing partners, and Canada Media Fund, Nunavut Film Development Corporation. We have Film GL in Greenland, and then Saha Film in Yakutian, and then our Sami Film Institute. And we launched this fund in 2018 at the Indigenous Film Conference, which we had in Godegaitno here in Sápmi, where Jesse and Bird, you were also, and many of our other Indigenous film colleagues were. And the idea behind the Arctic Indigenous Film Fund is that with the current situation and also the future development, where with climate change, and where everyone is looking to the Arctic, and it's all about industrialization. And here now in Sápmi, there is a lot of fights against, for example, there is this mining company. They want to put the mining spill in the sea, in the fjords, and our people are fighting this, and reindeer grazing lands are taken, and it's green industrialization or colonialism maybe also. And so we thought that these are our homelands, and we really need to have a strong voice in this development. So that's why we also need to build our own fund that can support our stories and the stories we feel are important to tell, and in that way also take down the structures, the financial structures nationally that are holding back our storytellers, our filmmakers, and preventing us from telling our own stories. So it's a really important development. And then also to think about the Arctic in a circumpolar Arctic perspective, co-productions and collaborations, instead of always thinking about north-south collaborations, even though this is, of course, also important, but it's really interesting to work in the circumpolar Arctic perspective, because we share so much of the same challenges, and we have the same landscapes and harsh climate and those kind of stories, so we can really relate. And we are now doing we have a slate of projects that Arctic Indigenous Film Fund has supported, and for example, there is this Arctic Chills, which are horror and mythical stories from Canada, Indigenous filmmakers in Canada, in Sápmi, in Siberia, in Greenland, and so yeah, and it's been interesting. And one very good example is that when we launched the fund, and also a project connected to the fund, which was Stories from the Ice, Canada Media Fund supported this project with a lot of funding. And I know Valerie Creighton, the president, it was not an easy thing to do because of the system and how to do this practically, but she did wonders and really wanted to support this project. And so I think it's like you also, Bert, you said so well here in the beginning that we are fighting this long history of cinema, and where our stories we haven't been able to tell our own stories. So I think it's important that we keep on fighting these structures. So yeah.
I agree. Thank you for that. Well, I think Valerie Creighton is an amazing ally to have at a high level at an institution who, is willing, like you said, to bend the structures, to accommodate and to make things work. So, I like to think that, we're always constantly seeking more of those. Jesse, for those people who I think who are our allies and who want to know more and be more helpful, like, you've done some brilliant writing around kind of specifically kind of, North American cinema and the Western, and how the Western kind of, represents the manifest destiny and the expansion of, of what's good, with the Indians being what's bad and in the way. But, in terms of like looking at that history of, of that narrative and us having to counter that, like, how would you define narrative sovereignty and, its theoretical and kind of practical level?
I mean, I think theoretically, I don't think it's that hard to define or understand. It's sort of in the two words, sovereignty over storytelling is basically what we're saying. In practical terms, I think it varies, right? Because in Canada, we have a very publicly funded cultural sector, a lot of state support for artistic and creative production, and so that is basically how Canada has historically secured its own narrative sovereignty, but it has never really extended that privilege to the First Nations, Métis or Inuit people that were here before there was a Canada, and so that's really how we advocate for it here, for ourselves. But that may look different depending on where your origin, at least in terms of not the idea of narrative sovereignty, but how you attain it under a colonial structure. I mean, for the Indigenous Screen Office, I should say, the advocacy for the founding of the office began, as I like to say, the day the Indigenous Screen Office was announced in Australia. That afternoon was when the advocacy began. And we've looked to all of these organizations that are on this video for inspiration and guidance in terms of how to build it out. The Indigenous Screen Office was only founded, Angela mentioned they were just celebrating, I think, 28 years or something like that. So the Indigenous Screen Office was founded in the summer of 2017. So that will tell you how long we had to advocate to get a similar body here. There's some key differences, which is that we're an independent organization. We're actually apart from Telefilm and the CMF, which are the existing funding bodies for screen production here in Canada. And that was important because it was felt that would accelerate the access and the resources available to Indigenous storytellers if we were to have our own, as opposed to beholden to others. And I'm very pleased to say in the last federal budget, we did receive 3-year funding of $40 million to our efforts, which will begin. I'm knocking wood and crossing everything I can cross that we will be launching that programming at the end of this month. Our first full slate of programming. I would be remiss to mention that that is actually only half of the amount we actually asked for. So there's still some work to be done. And we do have a co-production actually at TIFF. I believe the first ever Canadian-New Zealand co-production, Night Raiders by Danis Goulet is playing TIFF. It wasn't, I think, as fulsome a co-production as either anyone really wanted. There was some structural challenges, is maybe how I would put it. And I think that, I wanted to go that route to get to this point, which is, I think as our organizations gain capacity, it is worth us revisiting our international co-production agreements, because for Canada, those agreements are signed actually by the government and then held by Telefilm. Indigenous people are not involved at any level in that. And I think to further our narrative sovereignty, we on this call should start considering how we sign our own treaties between our organizations that aren't beholden to our respective colonial governments, and figure out the scheduling and the bureaucracy among ourselves to suit our various communities, and start to not rely on these colonial states to work together and expect them to actually acknowledge that we may have very different desires and outcomes than they do around these agreements. And so I look forward now that the ISO is gaining capacity. I think we're seeing the capacity build globally for this, that we can actually begin entering treaties the way our peoples have historically entered treaties, which are not these co-production treaties that exist now between these states. I'm actually talking about the old school treaties that our peoples would have signed with one another, which generally we've been very good at upholding our end of those things, Bird, historically, but maybe not so much some of the other folks. So I think I'm intrigued by what that future would look like, and how we could further accelerate that is already moving by asserting ourselves and saying we actually don't need other folks to negotiate this. We know what was going to work best, because I think, and I would hope everyone on this agree, I know I have storytellers who are desperate to work with storytellers from all of these places, including south of the medicine line, Bird, where we don't have treaties. But I think we have to start saying, my nation was completely bisected by the colonial border. The Anishinaabe lived, it was not a Canada-America thing. And so it's only the colonial border that means I can't make a film with my cousin from Minnesota. It's a totally made up thing. And likewise, it's made up in the North, where Inuit, they literally speak the same language, and there's just different colonial borders that have erected. I think the future is us getting to the point where we're doing this. We have these Zoom calls ourselves, or even better yet, we gather and feast and we talk it over, or not us, maybe physically us, but our peoples, and we sort this out. And I think together we can blossom a whole new era of storytelling globally, and honor, because we all know those figures, because we all have them. I know from every one of your regions, all those aunties and uncles who dreamt of this moment all those years ago. We're gonna get to do it, and so I'm very excited by that opportunity, and I look forward to those calls with everyone on this call.
Can I just shortly comment on that, Jesse, because it's so wonderful what you're saying now, and this is something we have been fighting for here in the Sami film industry, because we are one people living in 4 countries. So for us, the borderless thinking is in our backbones, and we have been fighting to not be under the Norwegian film regulation, where we can only give grants to Norwegian Sami producers and blah blah blah. So and we have managed to keep that independence, so we can, nobody asks where we send our grants. We can send it to Canada or to Russia or to Sweden and Finland. So I think it's so important what you are saying now, Jesse, that these treaties and these are all colonial structures, and we have to find our own ways of doing it, and we just nobody can prevent us from doing it. So yeah, it's really I totally agree.
Yeah. Well, I definitely also think, I mean, it'd be really fascinating, like, as institutions to explore that, kind of partnership. But I'm also really interested in what capacity of international law would allow, Indigenous sovereignty, to kind of play a role in that, international treaty making process. That would be really fascinating to think about. One of the things I think we're going to have to start winding down soon. Of course, this always happens in every panel, right? When it starts getting juicy, I do have to say, like, one of the things I want to bring up, is, Australia and, and Canada, you all have made significant strides in kind of exploring and launching protocols. I know in Australia, Dr. Terry Janke, really kind of helped design some of that initial work that I know Canada took into consideration in designing your pathways and protocols. I know Anna Lila and some of her crew, they collaborated with Disney, to really work on a collaborative, a treaty. It's almost a treaty between you and Disney, for the making of Frozen 2. But I just really want to make sure that we say something about these protocols, because we are experiencing this spike, this burgeoning of Indigenous storytelling filmically in cinema. But here in the States, for the first time ever, we're finally perforating those barriers of invisibility with Indigenous TV. So many of our Sundance alumni are spearheading, that wave right now. And so I just want to make sure that we all comment on, as our community, we historically understand the mining of our communities and the mining of our stories by, the corporate, driven filmmaking machine, which we've always tried to fight against. But, I feel like now that we're narrative sovereignty is blossoming, that's going to create more attention and more attempts to mine us. And so some of you have created protocols. Can you kind of talk about that to kind of help, protect our communities, protect our stories, give them tools to negotiate? Who would like to talk about that first?
Well, I can jump into it and just maybe start with the Disney collaboration, which was really important for our people. It was a big initiative also from the Sami politicians, and a really wonderful agreement was done between the Sami parliaments and the filmmakers or the Walt Disney Company, where it was very important that the collaboration benefits both parties, not just Disney and not. So also our people. So like we got a dubbed version of the film in Sami language, and also some, competence building opportunities afterwards, where Sami trainees are going to work at the studio in Burbank. And so so that has, at least for us, been important, that when there is inspiration, there also has to be collaboration, and we want to be part of that. So, yeah.
That was particularly groundbreaking, I have to say, between you and Walt Disney, the Parliament and Walt Disney Company. That's amazing.
Yes. Yeah.
Jesse, Angela, do you guys want to?
Well, I'll just quickly, and then I'll let Angela speak. I mean, we did we took great inspiration from the Australian Pathways and Protocols document, or protocols document. Ours is an attempt not to be very prescriptive, as most people realize. There's many nations on what is currently called Canada. They all have different protocols when it comes to storytelling. So really, it's a document that's meant to do couple things. Sort of give non-Indigenous folks a moment to reflect if they are going to attempt to tell an Indigenous story, and give them some things to think about, and maybe some guides around best practices if they are actually going to do that. And for our communities, I think the hope was that it would provide them information to ask, because not everyone knows about the movie business, or what to ask, or what contracts should look, those sorts of things, and really to arm them so that they can be prepared for this. We're actually entering phase 2, so we'll be doing a further development of the protocols. And I would say really key to their success here has been that we were able to fund, with our partnership with Netflix, we were actually allowed filmmakers to apply to us to fund protocol work. If they needed to seek permission from an elder or speak with a knowledge keeper or a story keeper or ceremony, what you would find, and I think this is true in general, is a lot of our filmmakers were doing those things, but on their own dime, on their own time, pre-development, outside of the regular industrial schedule. So that Netflix partnership allowed us to sort of instrumentalize the protocols in a way where they could become a budget line for people, where they could have money to do that work. Yeah. And that was really important. I think we're still evolving, but it was absolutely one of the most important things. That's the ISO did that in my very first year when I was all alone. And we took great inspiration from Australia, and we continue. I talked with Penny many times over the years about that document and that work, and that continues to be a very valuable exchange between my cousins in Australia and us, is around that protocol work and designing those sorts of living documents.
Wonderful. I think that we have run out of time, sadly. We have 1 minute remaining. Karen, did you want to say something quickly?
Oh, I just wanted to acknowledge really that protocols, as Jesse had said, it's part of assisting the wider industry. But, we've got the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. In Aotearoa, it was the Mātātua Declaration. Actually, there was a protocols book in 2008 that was supported by the Film Commission with Ngā Aho Whakaari, the Screen Collective, and our community, our film community. And those are being, worked through again with all the inspiration of my cousins on this call. But I guess one of the final things is that tūhono tangata, or the connections that we have to support one another. I really like that, Jesse. We've, Night Raiders is one of those examples. We've got Ngā Pai Whenua with Australia. But actually the whakapapa connections, or the actual people connections, is far more durable and long-lasting for all of us. And, if we stand together, then stand alone, we're vulnerable. But if we stand united, then we're much stronger. So, tēnā koutou.
Thank you. And with that, we'll leave that as our closing comments. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thank you for our panelists. Can't wait to visit you all in your homelands again soon. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.
Miigwech.